And welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and I thank you so much for joining us here on this beautiful broadcast that comes your way Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m. We're streaming live at those times at richarddugan.com. In addition, not just those, but also Wednesday at 9 a.m. for a special edition of Tell Me Your Story. And we hope that you will join us for all of those. And again, you can listen to those at richarddugan.com. We are podcasting on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, and other locations that you folks are reposting to, and thank you for doing that. We are also on YouTube, where you can watch these interviews. We'll have information in the video so that you can connect with our guest and find out more about what they are up to, what they're doing, and as I like to say, continue your evolutionary process. And then, if you like what we're doing here and you'd like to be a part of it, sometimes that's what people like to do. They like to get involved in the work that somebody's doing. And we would greatly appreciate that. If you would like to do that, this resonates with you, we have a PayPal and Patreon account for your security as well as ours. Any amount is welcome. And we thank those who have supported us, and we thank those who will. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. From the heart, I am grateful for any amount that comes through that helps us to keep moving forward. We also ask you to take time out during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, to go within, to spend some time listening to the still small voice in that quiet, peaceful, calm place, so that you can sort of recenter yourself, refocus, re-energize, rejuvenate, and come back into the real world. Although there are those who say this isn't the real world. Needless to say, come back into the material world and hopefully find your way through with a little more clarity and a little more focus and direction. So thank you for doing that as well. And we are trying to do that ourselves here on Tell Me Your Story. Our program today takes us back, interestingly enough, it takes us back to my old stomping grounds of Arizona. Certainly not my home city necessarily, but we're going to be talking with a very special guest today, and I'm really excited about this conversation that we are about to have. I'm always concerned whenever I have somebody of our guests' educational and practical background. I'm afraid that I may get processed in this interview, and hopefully I can get an analysis at the end of the program as to whether or not I'm stable, I'm okay, all is good, and life is, or I need help. And I've often said that you can never have too much help. We are all in need of help. My guest today is Richard D. Lane, MD, Ph.D. He's a member of the graduate faculty, professional neuroscience, that's GIDP, a professor of psychiatry and psychology, professor of psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience. Richard, my namesake, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here with you today.
Now, you are, with your PhD, you in both psychiatry and psychology. Obviously,
Right.
Psychiatry allows you, I don't know, is the biggest difference between the two that as a psychiatrist, you are able to prescribe medications for people who are having, I don't know if this is the right phrase, having difficulty coping with the world.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, my training involved, going to medical school and becoming a physician and learning all about the body and the brain. And with that background and with specialty training in psychiatry after medical school, you learn to diagnose serious mental illness and how to prescribe medications, but also how to do that in a safe manner, depending on the person's medical condition and other, vulnerabilities they may have. We also learn how to do psychotherapy, and I think excellent psychiatric care involves the combination of psychotherapy and medication management. Mm-hmm. Now, within psychology, there is the clinical discipline of clinical psychology, where people learn to become psychotherapists. They don't get the same medical training, but what they do get is scientific training in the science of the mind and behavior. So there's overlap in the skills clinically. My own Ph.D. in psychology was not in clinical, but was in experimental psychology. So what I did in my career was I first went to college, majored in psychology. I was fascinated by it. I had trouble deciding whether to go to psychology graduate school or medical school. Decided to go the physician route, but then I felt that something was missing. I really developed a passion for doing research because I really wanted to understand emotions and how they worked in the brain and how the brain-body interactions influenced our health. So that's why I went on and got a PhD in experimental psychology. And I was among the first to do brain imaging of emotion, functional brain imaging of emotion. And then went on from there to, kind of do both basic science and clinical work. And I've really enjoyed the dialogue between the two.
Now, I took a psychology course in college, junior college, where we sort of studied I don't know if I want to refer to them necessarily as the great philosophers per se, but people like the ilk of Freud and Jung and I'm maybe Socrates. I going way back, those kinds of things, and the other thing that and of course the only real experience I've had in regards to psychologists and therapy has been through the television series The Bob Newhart Show, because he was a psychologist. Now, how accurate that was, I don't know. I've been through a lot of personal growth and development programs in the 80s and early 90s. I actually went through a program called LifeSpring, which was sort of a part of EST. It was a branch off of EST. And I went through their 3 levels, and that was back in the early 80s, like, what was it? 81, 82, 83, something like that. And then there was another program that was developed in Phoenix by a printer who owned a company called Papago Printing. His name was George Adair, and he had established the Delta Vector and Omega Vector programs for people to go through. It was a 5-day intensive, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. And I learned an awful lot. And one of the things that I learned very early on was that when I said to myself, looking around the room the very first time I was there with my wife, she was the one that wanted to go. Now, my wife was totally blind, so she needed a guide. So I went with her, okay? Just so that she would be able to get around, right? And I'm looking around and they're going, you can't just sit there. You have to participate. And I got to looking around. I'm going, boy, I wish these people would get it. And it was a few days later, I began to realize I was in the room too. So that statement applied to me as well. So I was not I couldn't set myself apart. But one of the things that has really struck me about this whole area of our psyche, if that's the correct part of who we are or what we are, is the fact that it can turn on a dime sometimes, especially based upon our past. Now, you probably remember in the 80s, it was, we blame our parents. It's the reason I'm the way I am is because it's my parents' fault. My mom and my dad did this to me. In the 90s, we dealt with codependency. And as we approached the 2000s, the 21st century, we began to understand that we were interdependent. We were responsible for our lives. Of course, then we hit the 2016 presidential campaign and it was victimhood all over again. It was somebody else's fault that we were the way we were. Now, I don't want to go into that politically speaking, but that seems to be like the cycle that humanity seems to go through sometimes. What are your observations in that regard? What do you think? Is it still ongoing, or are we starting to get it?
Well, I think that I think we are starting to get it in the sense of I think we're making advances in understanding how psychotherapy works and how it can be made to work more effectively. I think one of the things you're referring to in these, different eras is the extent to which, where does the blame lie, if you will? How do I think there's a big difference between understanding where problems came from versus what is maintaining them in the present, and how do you make changes so that you don't have the same maintenance factors, and how can you take responsibility for your own mental health and overcome whatever life brought you earlier to have the best life possible. One of the reasons we're talking today is that in the past year, we published a book called Neuroscience of Enduring Change, Implications for Psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
And this book is an innovation because we're trying to make sense out of the hundreds of different psychotherapies that are out there. There are probably over 500 different psychotherapies.
Wow.
But the question is, are there some fundamentals about how psychotherapy works that we can identify? And I think one important new innovation is that whereas previously Freud, Jung, Socrates, etc., all they could do was introspect and think about things, psychologically. We have the ability now to study the brain and understand, a lot about how the brain works. And the brain is the infrastructure of the mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what's been possible is to say, okay, we've studied psychotherapy to see what really is important, what works in psychotherapy, but then we can now think about how that actually might be implemented in the brain. And when we think about brain systems, that really helps us converge on some fundamental principles. And so there's a fundamental advance in neuroscience that's really relevant here. 20 years ago, there was a seminal experiment in rats that proved that memories are not fixed or permanent, but they actually are updatable, okay? And so the things that happened to us in the past, they happened to us, but whenever we retrieve a memory, it goes into what we call a labile state and it becomes possible to update it or modify it with new information in the context of that labile state. And so when we do psychotherapy, we're trying to, I think, take advantage of that phenomenon to optimize the therapeutic benefits. And one of the things we know about memory is that emotion plays a very important role. We can't remember everything that happens to us. We need to remember the things that are most important. Mm-hmm. And emotion is a marker for that, okay? And so we recognize that a common denominator in problems that people have is that we've all had difficult experiences growing up, sometimes traumatic. Mm-hmm. And we develop ways to cope with that by putting all the pain aside. And when you spend a lot of time avoiding pain, emotional pain, that really can cause problems. And so we think that the common denominators in changing how you function is to recall those old painful memories, bring up all the old painful emotion, but importantly, take advantage of this reconsolidation mechanism by working with a therapist who can provide corrective experiences. The things that you're ashamed about, for example, you keep it to yourself. You talk to a therapist and they may view you in a very compassionate, non-judgmental, loving way. And it can be kind of a surprise to see that someone could actually feel that way about you when you harbor such negative feelings about yourself. We think that updates memories or schemas in your mind, and that will really enable you to view situations going forward in a different way. Memory is not just about the past, but it's a guide to the future.
But at the same time, you say that emotion is sort of the trigger, but I can attest to, and maybe this is something different, and I'll have you explain this. Sometimes, and I live here in Santa Barbara, so we get the marine layer rolling in every once in a while. Well, a lot more than once in a while. And
You get the what rolling in?
the marine layer, we have fog.
Okay.
Okay. And as it starts to clear, it reminds me of those times when my first wife and I would get on a bus, primarily with her music group that she was a part of in college, and they would drive across, and we would be staying in San Diego for a few days. We'd go to SeaWorld, and when we would go to SeaWorld, the fog was just burning off. And those were some very nice times that then elicit emotions. What about that aspect of both visual as well as auditory, sensory, olfactory, if you will, and sometimes even taste, the 4 or 5 senses in terms of triggering memories? Is that different than what you're talking about in terms of emotion?
No, it's not different. It's just a good example of the, close relationship between memories and emotions. But it's the more positive side of the association, if you will. Yeah.
Okay. The Neuroscience of Enduring Change is what we're talking about today. The latest work that my guest, Richard D. Lang, Dr. Lang has brought to our program today to tell us the story about this particular aspect. There's a wonderful line and I'm constantly quoting some of my favorite musicians, John Denver, one of them, and one of his songs says, "Changes somehow frighten me. Still, I have to smile. It turns me on to think of growing old." Now, I'm 61 years old now, here in 2021, as you and I are conversing. And I have to tell you that I tell people, I still have another lifetime to live. I have to outlive my great grandmother who lived to be 100. So I've got another lifetime to go. I have no idea what's ahead. I know that there are going to be all kinds of changes. And there was a book that I was told I had to read at one of my jobs years ago, back in the 80s. It was called Who Moved the Cheese? And I read the book, and I took it back to my boss, and I put it on his desk, and I said, "You seem to be under the misimpression, if you will, that I have a problem with people moving the cheese, whatever the cheese represents. So I don't have a problem with people moving the cheese, i.e., the change. I just need to know where you moved it. Just tell me where you moved it. That's all I want to know."
Mm-hmm.
So we're dealing with, and have for the last, I guess, 15, 17, 18 months, a major change, which I have to tell you I was thrilled with, because we were doing something different this time that we had never done before in my lifetime. Specifically, when the influenza would roll around when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, we kept going to school. They didn't tell us to stay home. I mean, they might say, if you're not feeling good, you got to stay home. Only this time they said, stay home. And they meant it. I mean, this was now an edict, if you will. And they shut down air travel, and all of these different things happened. And of course, I'm thinking, what incredible opportunities we have coming up that we don't even know exist yet. And there are a lot of people who actually did make a lot of money, not just on unemployment, and those kinds of things, but they started their entrepreneurial ventures, maybe making PPE, masks and gowns and things of this nature, and other areas. And I thought, this is a great time. When we start talking about change, which, as the old saying goes, is the one constant in the universe. And you talk about this, the neuroscience of enduring change. You're talking about dealing with it, facing it, embracing it, loving it. As George Bush once said, George Bush Jr. said, one of his speeches back, I think it was 2001, 2002, he said, "Bring it on, bring it on." And I say, bring it on, because it's going to come whether I want it or not. So I might as well learn how to accept it, right?
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Right. So we're talking about this is a fascinating topic, and we're talking about several different kinds of change. You're talking about, changes in your circumstances. COVID, for example, radically changes what daily life is like. Or when you age, you develop a disease or a disability of some kind. Your faculties, start to wane. That's also a change, right? That you have to deal with. The book about enduring change really has to do with the internal working models that we have in our own minds and brains with regard to how the social world works, how the world operates, in interacting with other people. What do you anticipate will happen in a family interaction or in a romantic situation or at work or with a friend? We have these schemas in our minds based on our past experiences, right? Because what we've learned about the brain, interestingly and fascinatingly, is that the brain is a predictive device, okay? It's too complicated, too computationally complex to just take raw data and, make sense out of it every single moment. What's much more efficient is to make a prediction based on our past experience and then update it if we can with the new sensory data. Okay, so what we're really dealing with is that having grown up in the environments that we did, we have a whole set of predictions. We have this internal working model that was very adaptive for when we were growing up, right? But then when we leave home, like for example, it's very adaptive. Let's say you grow up in an abusive home and parents are very demanding, and it's very adaptive to become very perfectionistic, right? To try to be as good as possible, right? But then when you leave home, being extremely perfectionistic is not such a good thing. It's a burdensome thing, right? So what we're talking about is these internal models, these schemas, and how do we change those, right? That's what the enduring change is about. Now, when we encounter things like COVID or, declines in our health, that then puts stress on the coping mechanisms that we developed. And sometimes people are able to thrive in the face of stress, but sometimes their functioning goes down. And that's when they might want to seek out a psychotherapist and to see to what extent is this current problem actually a manifestation of something that's been going on in many other episodes in life, and how can we change it so it doesn't keep happening again?
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that, and I do get what you're talking about. I mean, matter of fact, there was an instance that happened to me just recently, and one of the things that I have really been trying to do is to act and not react based upon past experiences. And there are days when that's a heck of a lot easier to do than others, because things can happen so fast, and you don't have time to stop and pause and process it in such a way as saying, okay, don't react. All right. Because that's what you always do.
Yeah.
Pause and formulate a plan here. I'm not a fan of drama. Okay. I'm not a fan of confrontation. Now, you and I, off air and privately, we might vent to one another. If we were close friends. I have a good friend. I've known him. I can't believe this. I've known him 50 years. Okay. And we still communicate. We went to grade school, high school, and college together. And we vent with one another. Okay. And we will say things that we would never actually do. All right. Those would be the reactions that we're venting. All right. Oh, I would do this and I would do that. But we know neither of us would actually carry out those particular actions. And we're just, it's almost as if we talk about it and we vent in that way, it's gone. It goes away. We know that we won't pursue that.
Hmm.
And then we can get down to, okay, so let's take a look at this from a practical, a logical perspective. As Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it.
Hmm.
Ergo, whatever challenge you face that you've faced over and over again. I was bullied in school. All right. So if I got bullied today, I would definitely handle it differently.
Sure.
I refused to give one general manager at a radio station back in 1990, 98 rather, 98. I refused to give him the satisfaction of quitting. So I hid out in the production room and I did my job and I did everything that I could. He treated me as if I had just killed his best friend. And the irony is, he hired me as if I was his best friend, which was rather interesting. So I said, I'm not going to quit. He's going to have to fire me. Well, they eventually did lay me off. And for those who know anything about broadcasting, when you're let go, all you get is your last paycheck. I got a major severance package, which told me they knew they had done wrong. But the point is, if that were to, and I did have that happen a few years later, where I got called on the carpet. And I just sat there and I had to keep from laughing. And this guy was just reaming me a new one.
Mm.
And I had to keep from laughing because I knew, first of all, that I was only doing my job. Just because one of the other employees didn't like it and quit. He was a chief engineer. I actually caused a chief engineer to quit because I was doing my job. But it was like, oh, I got it. I learned the lesson. Just sit. And you know about the open body posture where you put your feet on the floor, both feet on the floor, put your hands on your knees, and you just sit there straight back and you just listen.
Mm.
And you just listen. You don't necessarily take it in because you don't make it personal. You just listen because you know this person is coming from their stuff. And when it was all over, I said, okay, fine. One of the things I've noticed, Richard, is that we have a real problem with these kinds of changes that we're talking about because we don't communicate, not only internally, but externally. Case in point, the movie Batman versus Superman would have been a 15-minute movie if they'd had the conversation at the end of the movie, brought forward to the beginning of the movie. Okay. They wouldn't have had the battle, wouldn't have made a great movie, would have made $0. But that's kind of the way I look at what's going on in terms of our actions and reactions to change and what we're doing inside and whether we react or act.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, you're bringing up a lot of important points. So I would just touch on a couple of things. One is you talk about instances where you are inclined to react and you found ways to, keep the reaction under control. I think one of the things that we might be after in a psychotherapy treatment situation is to get to the bottom of why people react as they do and to aim to change how you view the situation so that you don't react in the same way. Okay. So I think that's the kind of, when we talk about enduring change, it's like shifting how you view the world and how you view yourself and therefore how you react. Okay. And how you behave. So that's one thing. But you're also talking about communication between people, but also I think communication within oneself. And I've been a student of emotions throughout my career, and emotions are really, if you don't know a lot about emotions, they just seem to be, problems or cause difficulties or make it difficult to think straight, things of that sort. But actually emotions are highly adaptive. That's why we have them, and they provide a kind of golden information that's specific to you about how you're doing in interaction with the environment right now with regard to your wants, needs, and values. And you're constantly getting feedback about that. Like, for example, if you're happy, it's because something good happened. If you're sad, you lost something. Um, but those emotions are information about your needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you learn how to tap into your emotions and pay attention to what you're feeling, that can tell you what you need in a situation. And then you can think about a situation differently and respond to it differently.
Mm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It makes, yeah, it makes perfect sense. It really does. One of the things I wanted to ask you about in this regard has to do with our DNA. Now, you know, you're doing this study, the neuroscience of enduring change. You're dealing with the brain, you're scanning it, all of these kinds of things, and you're looking for some baselines. And I get that. In all of science, medicine, and so forth, there are baselines. I get so frustrated with my primary care physician when he talks about the baseline for high blood pressure, the baseline for blood sugar. I had type 2 diabetes as of July 23rd of 2020. I no longer had type 2 diabetes as of September 15th of 2020. And it stayed down ever since because I knew the reason why. It was because of the pandemic. I mean, didn't you and people around you start eating comfort foods that are full of
Sure.
sugar and carbs? And carbs turn to sugar. All right.
Yep. Yep.
So, and he kept saying, "Oh, it's going to be a long road, Richard, a long." And he told me about the story of this one guy. Oh, yeah, he was in here. His number, his A1C was at 600 and something or other. Mine was 544, mind you. And that day, my blood sugar, my A1C was 11.2. And
Wow. That's a
he
lot of
told me this,
comfort food.
what's that?
That's a lot of comfort
That's a
food.
lot of we were buying from the middle of the grocery store, not the ends like they tell you to do.
Okay.
But I told him I knew why. And who's to say that my blood sugar isn't normally at, let's just say, 125, 130, 135? I know the norms are between 70, I believe it is, and 170. So as long as you're inside those lines, you should be okay, you know. Same thing with high blood pressure. My highest was 184 over 120. And of course, my wife, who's been in cardiology for decades, she says, "You're in the stroke zone. We need to go now and get this looked at." And I've been taking, I said, they checked all of the fluids and they found nothing, right? I said, "You're not, it's in here. I need a therapist. I need someone like you, Dr. Richard Lane, to help walk me off the ledge, as it were." But when you talk about looking for the norms, which is a wonderful thing, at least we have some parameters we can start working with. But then you start dealing with individuals, and I'll go back to the whole thing with the DNA, because my understanding is the DNA is the information that has been compiled that we were created from, so to speak. But that includes not just the physical, it includes the mental and the emotional, I would think maybe even, and the spiritual. Is there a connection? Have you found a connection in any way, shape, or form in that regard to what you have studied in the neuroscience end of enduring change and our DNA propensity or potentiality?
Well, genetics is not a particular, area of investigation or expertise on my part. But what I can say is that the idea that your genes or your destiny, has really been shown not to be exactly the case. What is really now well established is that there's that genes are always interacting with the environment, right? And so the outcome for you as an individual isn't just a function of your DNA, but it's the interaction between your DNA and your environment. And so in other words, if you, for example, have a sensitive temperament, right? If you have a sensitive, nurturing environment, then you're really going to thrive, right? Growing up. But if you have a very sensitive temperament and you have an insensitive environment, then you're likely to not do very well. Okay, that's a good example of how DNA isn't the whole story. It's
So
an
you're saying
interaction.
that
It's a combination.
it's more nurture than nature as the
I'm saying
dichotomy.
it's both. It's both, and it's
Sure it is.
complex.
Right. But you're saying that it's the nurture or environment, because to me that they would be the same thing, that really begins to shape who you are
Hmm.
more than
That's right.
the information, the DNA, the genes, the chromosomes, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right. And while we can, you gave the example of how we used to blame our parents. Well, parents actually did do things, but the fact is that's not the whole story, because the
Right.
outcome has to do with the combination of what you brought to it and what they brought to it, and then the outcome was you. But it wasn't just all them, right?
It's like, what have you done for yourself lately?
Uh-huh. Right.
We're talking with Dr. Richard Lane. He has a book called Neuroscience of Enduring Change. To me, this is fascinating to try to understand, and it isn't always easy. I would be the first to admit that I haven't got a clue most of the time. All I know is I'm listening to, as I mentioned at the front of the program, Richard, I'm listening a lot to that still small voice. What can you tell me? We've talked about, for example, the practical aspects, the physical aspects, the DNA, nature, nurture, and so forth. What about our intuition? What about that still small voice within us? Or if you want to put it in more practical terms, that gut feeling. It's like you know that you should do this. You always have a choice. As we talk on this program, we always have choice. I don't care what your situation is. You always have choices. You just sometimes don't know what they are. But what about that in terms of, let's just say, if you want to call it a higher power, or again, coming back down to brass tacks, that gut feeling?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying before about cultivating that ability to tune into yourself. I know some very successful people who really, when they're making an important decision, they, tune into their gut. That's very different from only tuning into your gut and making your, shooting from the hip and deciding at the moment, based on how you feel
Yeah.
at that instant. Okay. And we had a prominent politician in our lives who did that. But I think that when I was talking before about how emotion provides this golden information, that emotion starts in the body. That's your gut feeling. That's your
Oh.
intuition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to recognize that is really important information, and to pay attention to it. It doesn't necessarily dictate what you're going to do, but it's really important information to incorporate. Now, you can make lists of pros and cons in a given situation. Should I take this job? Should I move to this city? Should I be with this person or not? But that gut feeling is really super important, and I would give more weight to that while also considering the other things that you can logically think through.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am fascinated by all of this. This is really intriguing from the standpoint that, as we often speak of on this program, as I mentioned, we always have choices. We just don't know what they are sometimes, and it's
Mm-hmm.
important for us to expose ourselves, to get out into the world, and listen to and other people, and read other materials that you may even disagree with, because who knows, you may glean something out of there that might help you move forward in your forward motion as a better human being, if you will, a better person. And that's one of the things that is very interesting. I even interviewed a gentleman who I know of his political proclivities. We have a good conversation. We don't have any problems there. We don't agree politically, and that's okay. We get along, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
beautiful thing. And he's a young person. He's 23 years old. So I asked him one day. I said, "Have you ever read any books by people who are completely opposite or contrary even to your own personal philosophy, your own personal beliefs?" He says, "Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. He mentioned quite a number of different books that I haven't even read. And he said, oh, yeah, I read that one a couple of times because he wants to know. He's curious. And the interesting thing I find about people's perspectives is that I love this saying: we both can't be right, but we could both be wrong. Now, that's not actually true, because I remember when Pat Robertson came out following the 2020 election to make his comments about the man who lost. He said that that man does not lie. Okay. He said, based upon where he is mentally and emotionally and even psychologically, and he wasn't casting stones, mind you. He says, in his world, he's telling the truth. Now, how do we juxtapose those kinds of situations where we have individuals who don't want to or can't or refuse to look at what we would consider, you and I, we might look at a situation and we would probably agree on what just happened. But this third person says, "Oh, no. That wasn't a riot. That was tourists. Those were just tourists." Okay, and you know what I'm referring to. How do we get across that particular barrier or challenge, if you will, when we're trying to act instead of react to this world in which we live?
Yeah. Well, you bring up important issues. I think that I can relate what you're talking about to what I've been saying previously, and it goes like this. There's this really close relationship between what we think and what we feel. And remember how I talked about how growing up, we learn to avoid certain kinds of emotional pain, right? And then those patterns persist and we steer away from things that bother us. Well, I think, to take the example of, the recent election, I think, and I'm speculating here, but I think it's safe to say that, in the case of Donald Trump, he really honestly does believe that he won, because I think his the feeling associated with loss is just intolerable to him. I mean, okay. So as a result, I mean, he's developed a personality style that involves, saying things and doing things that are emotionally acceptable and avoiding things that are unacceptable. And don't take it from me. I mean, it's his niece, I guess Mary, who's a psychologist, I think has a pretty good handle on his mental makeup. But the point is that there are certain kinds of things, losing was just intolerable when he was growing up, and he developed this personality style.
Right.
The way it relates to, our book is that if you're going to change a fundamental pattern like that, you need to open up and allow the pain that you've been avoiding to be experienced, right? So, in other words, he can't deal with the possibility of loss, okay? So in psychotherapy, which he's not likely to do, but psychotherapy would be possible if he were to allow himself to open up and consider what it feels like to lose, what it was like in that environment with his dad, and how demanding his father was, etc., and to experience all the pain associated with losing, and then to have a therapist respond, but you're not, that doesn't make you a bad person. You did the best you could, right? Those are corrective experiences that can change and update the emotional meaning of the memory. So then going forward, you can entertain the possibility of losing, and you don't have to distort what we would consider consensual reality.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And regardless of whether that ever happens, okay, he is who he is. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Since we've kind of brought him up. And
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
that's right.
go ahead.
And there is no judgment here
Mm-hmm.
because each one of us is as we are. Okay. Regardless of what our beliefs are, whether they be
Mm-hmm.
philosophical, whether they be political, economic, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's one of the most difficult things for those who have been on the outs for the last 4 years, okay, of that administration, that he has been wrong, okay? And they were doing everything they could to make sure everybody else saw that he was wrong. Well, but that's just it. He wasn't wrong. We just didn't understand where he was coming from. Now, I'll share this with you because I haven't shared this with others. Well, I've shared this on this program, I should say, but I haven't shared it with you. And that is this. I went through 4 phases from 2016 September. I got sucked into the political stuff in September of 2016. Took me 6 months to get unsucked. And then I went through 4 phases. And the first one was the most difficult, but I knew I had to go there. And that was to say, and I can say it out loud now without any problem, thank you, teacher, we know who we're talking about, for teaching me how not to behave. The next phase was, I forgive you. But more importantly, I forgive myself for allowing myself to be drawn into this quagmire. Third phase, and this went over probably 5 or 6 months. Third phase was asking this question from a very heart-centered, humanitarian, you have a right to be here, I have a right to be here position. What is it that you're so afraid of that makes you behave and speak and act the way that you do? I'm not asking you to change. Oh, God, no, I'm not asking anybody to change. I just want to understand so that I can put it in context in my mind and I can move on. And then the fourth one was shared by one of my guests on this program. And it was 3 simple words, still coming from the same place as this third phase. I love you. Now, those people who over 4
Saying
years
that to yourself or to who?
To that person as well as to myself. I love you. You have a right to be here. You're a human being. You're just playing out your role, as Shakespeare said. You know, all the world is a stage and we're but actors. And that's where we've got to come from and saying, look, I can't control you and I don't want you to control me. I can control me. Okay. Right. And you are going to do what you are going to do. And I have to let that happen and be okay with that.
Right.
Okay. Now that doesn't mean that someone might say, well, what are you going to do about Hitler? That's a different story because now you've got an individual who is now trying to control hundreds of thousands of millions of people, wipe out millions of people. That's a whole nother story that the collective population has to come together and say, unacceptable. This is not the way we function in society. This is not the way we do it. And then subsequently, World War II. So what are your thoughts in that regard to whether somebody were to use those 4 phases that I went through or something else to begin that process of saying, look, this is the way this person is. This is the way this situation is. I can only deal with how I deal with that person or situation.
Well, one phrase in particular that caught my attention was, the control that you have over yourself versus other people. I totally agree that you shouldn't try to change people. You need to accept them as they are. But with regard to controlling yourself, what this book is about, what psychotherapy is about, is that we're sometimes inclined to do things because of motivations that we're not aware of, right? And I think that the end result of a successful psychotherapy and maybe the process that you went through is that you have a better understanding of yourself, and it expands the range that you have to make choices and therefore, control what you do, how you view yourself and how you view other people. Okay, in other words, you can make changes within yourself. And, we think that we have more of a handle on how such changes come about.
Yeah. It's interesting too, those things that happen in our world, whether they be man-made or natural, that level the playing field. Natural disasters, earthquakes, monsoon, tsunamis, wildfires that we have here in California, in the Southwest, and so on and so forth, whatever you want to bring up, tornadoes and hurricanes and whatnot. And boy, I'll tell you what, it doesn't matter how much money you've got, how much prestige you've got, how much whatever it is you think you've got.
Yeah.
If you're caught in that, you're just like me, and I'm just like you now.
Yep.
And that changes the thought process too.
It really does, to tap into your common humanity. And that's very humbling. And that's really important to remember.
Very fascinating stuff. My guest is Richard D. Lang, and we are talking about, Dr. Lang and I are talking here about Neuroscience of Enduring Change. And we are also discussing the concepts of the implications, I should say, for psychotherapy. And I want to ask you a question in regards to that. I hear some of the statistics about how many people are in therapy, okay? Whether it's a psychologist or psychiatrist or counselor or whoever. I'm just wondering, how does one know that, let's just say, they need therapy, that they should seek out therapy? What are some of the signs that I might want to look at in that regard? If I have a horn growing out the back of my head, I better go see a doctor. But how would I know that I need therapy?
Well, I think so. Therapy can be helpful to anybody who wants it. I think there are a few ways of thinking about it. I mean, the most common syndromes are ones of depression or anxiety, panic. Also, if you've had early life trauma, like abuse and neglect, that's likely to have effects. The question is, how happy are you with your current life? To what extent do you feel like some of the problems that you have keep recurring, right? And you don't know why? I would say in that situation, that would be a good indication to come for psychotherapy, right? Because things may happen in your life that are beyond your control, but the common denominator is you. So how are you dealing with these things? And maybe you can find ways to deal with them that are going to enable you to get through it better and enjoy yourself more.
What about the trauma of 2020 and actually leads into 2021? I'm hearing some statistics that we are in for a tsunami of mental health issues. And I have to wonder if maybe what we're experiencing across this country right now here in 2021, with the number of mass shootings that are happening. One weekend there were 15, just recent. Talk to us about the traumas of 2020.
Well, I think the social distancing, as necessary as that was to stop the spread of the virus, really interrupted, and prevented social connections that we all need, whether it be friends, family, loved ones. Also, if you're in the house, with same people day in and day out, it's a little bit of a pressure cooker. Sometimes it can make, relationships even better, but can also put strains on it. So I think that, a vital resource for feeling good was kind of taken away. So there's no question that, symptoms of depression, anxiety, loneliness, sleep problems, they definitely increased during COVID. Okay, and I think this has a lot to do with it. Not to mention the unemployment, the financial anxieties, et cetera, as well as grief associated with loss of people important to us. So, I mean, there are just so many reasons why we would have symptoms and distress, and hopefully, things are going to get turned around now.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the hope that we have had, and I think that it's beginning to change. Things are beginning to move in the direction, opening things up. In California, June 15th is supposedly a benchmark for us here in California. We'll see what happens following that. I know that there are still people who are concerned about quote unquote super spreaders. By the same token, the number of people, myself included, who have been vaccinated is way up. I dealt with the side effects over a weekend that after we had it, and it was really quite something in that regard. So yeah, we all handle it differently. We all handle it differently.
Sorry
I know
about
that
that.
we are fast approaching the end of our program here, but I want to thank you so much for being a part of this broadcast and the conversation here and talking about neuroscience. And just real quickly, I like to define terms. Usually I do it at the front end of the program, but I'll put it here. What is neuroscience?
Well, neuroscience is a broad field, but it really pertains to the brain and how the brain works. And I think of, in this context, when we're talking about psychotherapy, we're talking about the mind and how the mind works. But the mind is an expression of the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of the senses that we have, all of the faculties that we have, memory, attention, emotion, vision, hearing, it's all happening in the brain. And so the reason why we're highlighting this is that our knowledge about how the brain works is really, expanding exponentially. There's still a lot we don't know, but the things that we are learning, for example, when it comes to memory and emotion, are really informative and really constrain and kind of influence how we think about those things in a context like psychotherapy. So, our ability to study the brain just keeps growing, and we're learning more and more. And I think it's paying dividends.
Did you have to go through therapy in terms of your education in psychiatry and psychology? Was that part of the curriculum?
It's recommended. It's not required. I did do that myself, and interestingly, I started it, as an educational endeavor, and lo and behold, discovered that there were some things to work on that went beyond pure intellectual curiosity. I think that what's absolutely the case is that if you're going to be an effective therapist, you really need to have had the experience of being in therapy yourself. Otherwise, you can't really know what it's like to be on the receiving end of it.
Mm. And from a more philosophical perspective, maybe I have to use the word religious perspective, what was your upbringing and how does that relate to your psychiatry and psychology practices and working with people, as well as certainly teaching all of this? Because we sort of kind of touched upon the intuition, which a lot of people would put in that category.
You're asking about my spiritual upbringing?
Yes.
Is that? Well, my own personal upbringing was that my family is Jewish. I'm Jewish. My father actually happened to be a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist himself, and he wasn't particularly religious, so we weren't very devout believers in religion, but there was very devout belief in Freud and psychology as a guide. And let me just say that I don't think that in retrospect, I'm not sure that really was so smart. I think that these religious practices and traditions that have been around for thousands of years, are tried and true, and they really, I think should be taken very, very seriously. We need to be humble when we think that, we've discovered possibly better ways. But the things that I've talked about with regard to psychotherapy aren't incompatible with religious beliefs. I think that religious beliefs can be very sustaining and very supportive, and can help people get through stuff. And the idea of loving your neighbor, as much as you love yourself or more, is, it's tremendous wisdom, and it's very useful. But I think it's also true that you can only do so much, through your rational mind and making conscious choices. And I think one thing that psychotherapy can do is kind of help you get in touch with some of the more irrational parts of yourself and harness them so that they can expand your ability to, adapt and respond to your current situations.
Yeah. And only because you brought it up, I feel like we're in a courtroom. Your Honor, I can talk about this because he brought it up in his testimony earlier. I can address this now. I watched a documentary on the last days of World War II, specifically Germany, where Hitler knew he was losing. So he wasn't going to win the World War, but he was going to work on winning the war against the Jews to annihilate as many as he could before it was all over. And some of the people that they interviewed talked about their belief in God. One a woman said that at one point she just stopped believing, and then when certain things started happening a few years later, she and this was going back. Actually, it's more recently. She finally was starting to talk to God again. So it was like her faith was sort of restored. And one of the things that has perplexed me, and I haven't been able to yet get an answer, and I'm looking for one, and I'm actually going to find one here with someone here in Santa Barbara who can address this, because I honestly think this is important because it gives us points of reference. I want to know what it is about Jewry that is, as was phrased in the documentary, poison to civilization. I don't get it.
What it is about what?
What is it about Jewry, Judaism, if you will? They used the word Jewry, but Judaism that is a poison to society, that the Jews have to be eliminated completely. I have never heard the list of the 10 things that Jews represent that is so abhorrent to that group of people back there in the 1930s and 40s, and yet many of them weren't Aryan. They were brunette. It is even said Hitler had Jewish blood, that he denied, and so forth. So I've often wondered, when we start segregating ourselves from one another, why are we doing that? What is it about that group? Because it doesn't make any sense to me, even though I don't know what the criterion is. You're a human being. I'm a human being. Isn't that enough that we belong together?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to finish up because I'm running a little bit late. But, it's a great question, and I've been thinking about this as well. I can't say exactly. I mean, it's not just Jewish people who are discriminated against. Obviously, Blacks, Hispanics, people of color, and minorities, et cetera, et cetera. I think what it comes from, we can look to our evolutionary neighbors, the primates, and, they're very, very hierarchical, right? And in human society, we're also very hierarchical. And, people, need to feel good about themselves. And if they feel put down or at a disadvantage, they need to somehow find a way to feel better about themselves. And so kind of, if you're feeling put down by outside forces, then if you put someone else down, it's a mechanism for feeling better about yourself. I think that's fundamentally what it's about.
Yeah.
And I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But that's the way we're built. And I think the way to deal with it is to be aware of it and to take that into account.
Dr. Richard Lane, I know you've got to run here. If I may have 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you really quickly 3 basic questions that I ask all of my guests, so I don't want to lose this opportunity, and I'll make this very quick. I will share with our listeners all of the other particulars later. But the first of those 3 questions is, who is Richard Lane?
I haven't been asked that in a while. He's a former hockey player who who's fascinated by the mind and wants to help people, and has transformed his competitive instincts to try to do good for other people.
What is it that you hope to or want to achieve through the work that you are doing now?
I really want people to do the work that I'm doing now. I want to help psychotherapists to hone their skills, take into account what we're learning from neuroscience, and perfect their ability to help other people. And my work on emotions more generally is aimed to enable people to be better able to process their emotions in order to improve their health.
And finally, what is your life's purpose?
Yeah. My life's purpose at this point is to capitalize on all the advantages that I've had and the education that I've had to continue doing the work that I've done to help as many people as possible. And so on that note, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this, because this really enables me to, share the work I've done with other people.
Absolutely. And I thank you so much for giving us so much time. And I want to let our listeners know that this program is here. Tell me your story, New Paradigms for a New World, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. Until our next podcast, videocast, love to love.